Ray Charles had 12 children by 7 different women, and not one of them ever truly had him, because the only thing Ray Charles was ever fully devoted to was the music. That is a sentence that sounds like a judgment. It is not. It is simply the truth, a truth that the people who loved him most understood better than anyone. That is the version of the story that fits neatly into a headline. It is also the version that misses almost everything that matters, because the truth about Ray Charles and the women in his life is not a story of carelessness. It is not a story of cruelty. It is something far more complicated and far more human than either of those things. It is a story that requires patience and honesty and a willingness to sit with contradiction. It is the story of a man who learned what love was from a woman he lost at 15, who spent the rest of his life searching for something he could never quite name, who gave the world the most tender love songs ever recorded, and struggled every single day to be tender in return, who was capable of extraordinary feeling and extraordinary distance, sometimes in the same moment. Stay with this story, because behind every note Ray Charles ever played, there was a woman, and behind every woman, there was a wound that never fully healed. To understand Ray Charles the musician, you have to understand Ray Charles the man. And to understand Ray Charles the man, you have to start at the very beginning, with the woman who made him. The first and most important woman in Ray Charles's life never heard a single one of his hit records. She died before he made any of them. She never heard Georgia on My Mind. She never heard Hit the Road Jack. She never heard the voice that would one day move millions of people to tears in concert halls around the world. Her name was Aretha Williams, and she was his mother. Aretha Williams raised Ray Charles alone in the grinding poverty of rural Georgia. She was not an educated woman in the formal sense. She was not a wealthy woman by any measure, but she was a woman of extraordinary will, and she made decisions for her blind son that most people, in her circumstances, would never have had the courage to make. Decisions that flew in the face of what the world expected from a poor black woman in the American South in the 1930s. When Ray Charles began losing his sight at age 4, Aretha refused to carry him, refused to lead him by the hand everywhere he went. She made him memorize the layout of their home, made him count his steps to the door, to the well, to the road. She told him, in words he would repeat for the rest of his life, that he was blind, not stupid, that the world would try to make him helpless, and that he must never, under any circumstances, allow it. These were not gentle words. They were not the words of a woman who had the luxury of being gentle. She taught him something else too, something she never said out loud, but that Ray Charles absorbed through every interaction, every sacrifice, every quietly difficult day they spent together in that small house, with no electricity and no running water, and very little of anything except each other. She taught him that love is not soft, that real love is demanding, that real love holds you to a standard, even when, especially when, holding you to that standard is the harder choice. Ray Charles internalized this completely, perhaps too completely. When Aretha Williams died in 1945, Ray Charles was 15 years old, blind, alone, and completely without the one person who had made the world navigable. The grief that followed was not the kind that passes with time. It was the kind that relocates. It moved inside him and stayed there permanently, reshaping everything it touched, coloring every relationship he would ever have for the rest of his life. Every love song he ever wrote carried a trace of it. Every woman he ever reached toward was, in some way, a version of the woman he had lost. This is the foundation. Everything else, every relationship, every child, every heartbreak that followed across 5 decades, has to be understood in the context of what Ray Charles lost at 15 years old. He was not simply looking for a partner. He was not simply looking for companionship or affection, or the ordinary things that people look for in love. He was looking for a home, a specific kind of safety that he could never find again, because it had died in Georgia in 1945, and no one, no matter how much they loved him, could bring it back. By the early 1950s, Ray Charles was a young musician building a name for himself on the road. He was charming, talented, magnetic in the way that truly gifted people often are, as if the energy required to produce their art radiates outward and draws everything toward them. He was also deeply lonely, in the particular way that people who perform for thousands of strangers every night can still be profoundly, achingly lonely. It was during this period that he met the first woman he would marry. Her name was Eileen Williams. They married in 1951, when Ray Charles was 20 years old and still very much finding his footing in the music business. She was, by all accounts, a warm and patient woman who understood, or believed she understood, what she was signing up for. A musician's life, long absences, uncertain income, motel rooms and tour buses, and the particular rhythm of a man who measured his life in shows rather than seasons. What Eileen did not fully anticipate, what perhaps no one could have fully anticipated, was the sheer totality of Ray Charles's commitment to his music. He was not simply dedicated to performing, he was consumed by it. The road was not a hardship he endured to make a living. The road was where he felt most alive, most himself, most free from the grief and the uncertainty and the grinding difficulty of a life he could not see, but had to navigate with absolute precision every single day. The marriage lasted only a few years. It ended quietly, without drama, without the kind of public unraveling that would characterize some of his later relationships. Eileen Williams moved out of Ray Charles's life as gently as she had entered it, but she left behind something important, the first clear evidence of a pattern that would define every significant relationship Ray Charles would ever have. The pattern of a man who was capable of profound love, but incapable of the ordinary daily work that love requires to survive. The pattern of a man who loved deeply, but could not stay. In 1955, Ray Charles married for the second time. Her name was Della Beatrice Howard Robinson, and if Eileen represented the beginning of the story, the first tentative attempt at building something permanent, then Della was its beating heart, its moral center, the woman against whom everything else in Ray Charles's personal life would ultimately be measured. Della Howard was a gospel singer, strong, grounded, rooted in faith in a way that gave her a stability Ray Charles both admired and could not fully access. She was not the kind of woman who would be swept away by glamour or seduced by fame. She had seen enough of the music world to understand its costs. She saw Ray Charles clearly, the genius and the damage simultaneously, and she chose him anyway, not naively, not blindly, but with the full knowledge of what she was taking on, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who has made a decision and intends to honor it. Together they had 3 sons, Ray Charles Robinson Jr., David Robinson, and Robert Robinson, for a period, a brief, fragile, genuinely hopeful period. It looked like Ray Charles might have found what he was searching for, a home, a real one, a family with weight and warmth and the specific texture of something that could last. He was, by the accounts of people close to him during those early years, genuinely happy, or as close to genuinely happy as a man carrying his particular grief could manage to be. But the road called, and Ray Charles answered, every time, without fail, without exception. He was touring more than ever in the late 1950s and early 1960s, performing hundreds of shows a year, recording prolifically at a pace that would exhaust most artists half his age, building the business empire that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest and most independent musicians of his generation. And while he was doing all of that, Della was at home in Los Angeles, raising 3 sons, managing a household, waiting for a man who was always almost on his way back. Here is what history rarely mentions about Della Robinson. She knew about the other women. She knew about the relationships that existed alongside their marriage, about the children being born to other women while she raised their sons in Los Angeles. And she stayed, not out of weakness, not out of ignorance or denial or an inability to see what was in front of her. She stayed out of a conviction, deep, considered, possibly stubborn, that the family she had built with Ray Charles was worth protecting, that her sons deserved a father, even an absent one, that love, in her understanding of it, was not conditional on being the only one. They divorced in 1977, after 22 years, after 3 sons and countless absences, and a loyalty that Ray Charles acknowledged but never fully deserved. In later interviews, Ray Charles spoke about Della with a reverence that was notably different from the way he spoke about almost anything else. He said she was a good woman. He said she deserved better than what he gave her. He did not say it with self-pity or with a performance of regret. He said it with the flat, unadorned honesty of a man who had spent a lifetime being precise about everything except his own emotional responsibilities and had finally run out of reasons to be otherwise. Between Eileen and Della, and alongside Della and after Della, There were others. Many others. Ray Charles moved through relationships with the same combination of total intensity and eventual detachment that characterized everything else he did. He was fully present when he was present, magnetic, attentive, capable of making a person feel like the only thing in the world that mattered. And then the music called, and he was gone. Not cruelly, not coldly, simply gone, as if he had never quite fully arrived in the first place. There was Marianne Fisher, a blues singer of real talent, who toured with his band in the late 1950s. Their relationship was intense and musical and charged with the particular electricity that exists between two people who speak the same creative language. She understood his music from the inside. She pushed him in ways that other women could not, because she could meet him where he actually lived. But it ended, as most things with Ray Charles ended, when the road moved on and the next thing demanded his complete attention. There were women in cities across America, in hotel rooms and backstage corridors in the brief suspended moments between one show and the next. Women who knew him briefly and intensely, and then watched him leave with a clarity that suggested he had never quite intended to stay. Ray Charles was not careless with these women in the way that truly careless men are careless. He did not pretend to offer more than he was offering. He was honest, in his way. He simply could not give what most of them, in the quiet of their own hearts, were hoping for. He could not give permanence. He could not give stillness. He could not stop moving long enough for love to take root in the ordinary way. The 12 children he fathered, by 7 different women across several decades, are not a footnote to his story. They are not a scandal to be minimized or a detail to be explained away. They are evidence of something important and complicated about the man himself, of someone who created life as abundantly and as instinctively as he created music, who was generous with his presence in some moments and entirely absent in others, who gave the world everything he had and still somehow managed to give the people closest to him not quite enough of what they actually needed. Several of his children have spoken publicly about what it was like to grow up with Ray Charles as a father. The accounts are remarkably, almost eerily consistent. He was not a cruel father. He was not dismissive or contemptuous or deliberately absent. He was simply elsewhere, even when he was in the room, physically present on occasion, emotionally available in flashes, but fundamentally and irreducibly oriented toward something internal, toward the music, toward the next performance, toward whatever was happening inside him that none of them could fully reach. His children loved him. Most of them said so clearly, and most of them also said, quietly, that loving him had required learning to want less than they deserved. And yet the music tells an entirely different story. Georgia on My Mind is not the work of a man incapable of feeling. It is the song of someone who understands longing so deeply it has become structural, built into the way he hears silence, the way he reaches for a chord, the way his voice breaks on a word that most singers would simply pass through. I Can't Stop Loving You is not a performance. It is a confession. Drown in My Own Tears is not a metaphor. It is a document of interior weather so precise it could only have been written by someone who had actually been there. The women in his life understood this. Several of them said so in interviews conducted years and decades after his death. That being with Ray Charles, truly with him, even briefly, even incompletely, was unlike anything else they had ever experienced. That his attention, when it was fully directed at you, was like standing in direct sunlight after a long winter. Warm, overwhelming, impossible to look at directly. That the tragedy was not that he was incapable of love. He was clearly, obviously, deeply capable of love. The tragedy was that he could not make it last, could not hold it still long enough for it to become the ordinary, sustaining, daily thing that the people around him needed it to be. Della Robinson attended his funeral in June 2004. She sat with their sons and watched the world mourn a man she had loved, in one form or another, for the better part of her adult life. Whatever she felt in that moment, grief for the man, relief that the waiting was finally over, pride in the sons she had raised, something unnamed and deeply private that belongs only to her, she kept entirely to herself. She was, to the very end, a woman of extraordinary dignity, the kind of dignity that is not given, the kind that is built, slowly, over decades of choosing grace when something else would have been easier. There is something in Ray Charles's story that resonates far beyond the specific details of his relationships. It is the story of a particular kind of person, shaped by loss so early and so profound, that love, for them, is always already shadowed by the certainty of its ending. Who love with everything they have, because they know from experience that everything can be taken, and who cannot stay, because staying requires a faith in permanence that was taken from them before they were old enough to understand what permanence meant. Ray Charles lost his mother at 15. Everything after that was, in some sense, an attempt to find her again, and an acknowledgement, quiet and lifelong, that he never would. Ray Charles gave the world music that'll outlast everyone who ever heard it. Songs that'll be playing in rooms that haven't been built yet, moving people who haven't been born yet, to feel things they won't have words for. He gave the women in his life something harder to name and harder to hold, moments of extraordinary connection, followed by the particular ache of watching someone extraordinary leave. He could not help it. He had been leaving since he was 15 years old, standing beside his mother's grave in a small Georgia town, learning for the first time, and forever, what it felt like to lose the one thing you could not live without. The music was always how he stayed, even when he couldn't, even when nothing else could make him.